The Easter eggs were already kind of going, but I took my programmer's background and started doing encrypted messages.
You were the face of zombies.
Hmm.
And, and it's funny, like going and looking, there are still people out there that are like, he said he was going to reveal this Easter egg. Like there was,
Yes.
has everything been found? Is
No.
there still something out there? There's still stuff
Yeah.
out there that you
Oh God, yeah.
buried in some of the
Oh,
stuff
God,
that.
yeah. And Jeff, to be honest, if I have my way, I'll be dead and buried, and there'll still be stuff in there, and I'll be quite happy.
I'm going to tell you how all this really began.
Monty told us the truth. Our journey is the very reason this madness exists. We are the ones who fractured the universe.
I'm thinking that people might not get a single one in DLC 4.
Not get a single cipher.
It's possible.
You're gonna make it that hard.
I think there's people out there who there's such passion in the community. I don't watch it close enough, but I am sure there are people who are still working on some of those ciphers.
Oh, of course there is, yeah.
And I love that because there's other things that will appear.
Everything you know is a lie. This video may be the single biggest and most important piece of Call of Duty Zombies lore I have ever posted, and completely changes our interpretation of the zombie storyline as a whole, reinvigorating its origins with a completely different perspective. I think we have not only discovered the true origins of Doctor Monty and the Shadow Man, but potentially even the impossible Easter egg, and it's going to change the foundations of all that we think we know. All of that and more in this video, so stay tuned. Recently, a ton of developer documentation for zombies from Black Ops 3 and other games has surfaced online. Recently, I posted a video breaking some of them down. I discussed John Dee and the Dee Resurrectionists that are mentioned in the document describing the ranking system, and how it may relate to the infamous impossible Easter egg. While that video was interesting, late into its production, I quickly realized I was on the edge of a very deep rabbit hole. With this, I decided to split the video in two, and spend some time researching and deep diving further for a sequel. Now, this video is being produced simultaneously as part 1, so if any fans or I discover more after the first part has released before this part, that will all be saved for a part 3. Thanks to some assistance and research from the team at KRONORIUM, who I will link in the description of this video, I think we have incidentally broken open the true origins of the Call of Duty Zombies storyline, and what we previously thought was a much simpler explanation for the origins of the Zombies universe. Let's begin with the story of John Dee, as told in that leaked concept document.
In 1592, the mathematician, philosopher, and occultist to Queen Elizabeth I, the Dr. John Dee conducted a series of experiments in which he was surprised to discover a continuing series of small disturbances, or ripples in the fabric of the ether, the mysterious and encompassing medium in which the earth and the heavens hung. Although there's no way he could have known it at the time, these were the echoes of the first teleportation systems being used at their reason, whose energy was propagating in time as well as in space. Determined to discover their source, he embarked on a series of experiments to monitor the ether with ever-increasing accuracy. Soon he would devise an apparatus of such incredible sensitivity, his ethereoscope, that would allow him to divine the subtlest of vibrations, some of which, when the device was connected to a cone for moving the air, would sound like human voices. He determined 2 names that were repeated over and over again, which he interpreted as Sem and Riktovar. He began to understand that the ether was a source of power that these mysterious entities were drawing sustenance from. To what ends, he could not be sure. As 1599 gave way to 1600, the etheric bow wave created by the vril-infused destruction of the earth ripped through the equipment in his laboratory, allowing etheric energy to push through the veil between worlds. The corpses he was dissecting in order to discover the function of their anatomy were raised as zombies. Zombies who spoke the words that he had been hearing before the Royal Guard were able to put them down. Dee realized that these forces exploiting the ether were perverting the course of nature, and with royal decree, he established the esoteric brotherhood of Dee Resurrectionists in order to study the ether and to guard against any future horrors that might emerge from it. The Society has made great strides in its research, able to harness the energy of the ether to its own ends, even if, rumor is to be trusted, able to harness it for travel to remote times and places unseen by human eyes. Under the watchful care of the mysterious Man of Shadows, who may in fact be John Dee, made immortal by experiments carried out by the Order in London in the winter of 1608, the Brotherhood seek to safeguard all of creation from the monsters unleashed upon neighboring realities by the incessant warring of the powerful entities within the void.
Man of Shadows surely brings someone to mind immediately, doesn't it? However, just as I initially posed in my last video, I want to reiterate here that I do not think this story of John Dee is actually the story of the Shadow Man. In part 1, I mentioned that the motivations and actions of the esoteric Brotherhood of De-Resurrectionists lines up far more with the actions of Dr. Monty and the Keepers. They seem to want to preserve reality and protect it, standing in direct opposition to what the Shadow Man and the Apothecans do, which is to create chaos in the universe by consuming worlds. It's possible that this text, written in a document above the various ranks for leveling up in Black Ops 3 Zombies, and a sort of preamble text to explain their names, as the max rank is still labeled De-Resurrectionists in the final build of the game, could potentially also set up the Shadow Man as a potential ally to preserve the twist in Shadows of Evil's narrative when he betrays you. All of the launch marketing for Shadows of Evil presented him as a good guy, someone trying to help their characters, and he only betrays you when you unlock the Pack-a-Punch. Who could have seen that coming? This could also be why the text does not ever specifically say Shadow Man, but rather Man of Shadows, and may in fact be John Dee. The twist was going to be that he in fact was not, leaving room for Dr. Monty to step into that role later. Also, the Special Forces Brotherhood is still referenced in the calling cards you get with it, showing that in canon John Dee was granted by the Crown the order to start the Brotherhood of De-Resurrectionists, showing this is not a cut plot, but is still real. Once the research began to go deeper, though, this connection from Dee to Monty went from a perhaps to undeniable. Let's break down some of the things about John Dee's life that are interesting. John Dee is a real-life figure who was a famous mathematician, scientist, alchemist, philosopher, and mystic who gained popularity in the court of Elizabeth I. Unlike the present day, the lines between science, magic, philosophy, and religion were extremely blurred at the time, to where many who were involved with one of these fields of study were involved in all of the others too. John Dee, in particular, followed the esoteric philosophy of Hermetic Christianity, a devout believer wherein he believed that God was essentially an architect, having made the world using numerology and geometry, and through gaining knowledge of these things, he believed one could become closer to God. In fact, given that John Dee's explicit mention in the Ether storyline comes into Eisendrach, where we get the potential impossible Easter egg book, John Dee Illuminated De-Resurrectionist, it feels worth noting that this is also where Monty first attempts to contact our characters directly, through a cipher. Translated, it reads, "I cannot appear directly to you, I can only help you on your way. You guys are really making hard work of this." But if this tenuous link was it, this wouldn't be much of a theory. So let's get on to what really sparked this video. The first real connection of substance between John Dee and Monty that I want to present to you is found in Revelation's Kino. By far, one of the most mysterious radios in the map is the one where we find Monty reciting Act 4, Scene 1 from The Tempest, a play by William Shakespeare.
Our rebels are now hidden. These are actors, as I foretold you, for all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself. Yea, all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little lives are rounded with a sleep.
First off, there are tangible connections between Dee and Shakespeare, but that on its own means nothing. If we actually research the scene, however, immediate alarm bells should go off. Prospero, the character whose lines Monty is reciting, is widely noted to have been directly inspired by John Dee, and indeed, some have viewed the entire play as a defense of John Dee, who at the time was under public scrutiny for witchcraft. This radio, once a seemingly random, innocuous clip of dialogue of little value, suddenly becomes the key to this whole mystery. Monty is winking to the audience and telling us that he is Prospero. He is John Dee.
Dr. Monty is just one of the many names he's been known by.
The Shadow Man, reportedly once the best friend of Dr. Monty, tells us that he isn't even a real doctor.
He's not even a real doctor. I would know.
Well, in the case of John Dee, that's absolutely true. Despite his incredible scientific and alchemical prowess, Dee never earned a doctorate in any field, likely because he pushed the boundary of what was religiously acceptable at the time. It may be that no university would allow him to undertake his research. Therefore, once he achieved the power he did, becoming near godlike, he applied the title to himself, believing he had earned it. Some people did refer to him as a doctor in real life, even though he never officially was. The leaked internal document from Treyarch even calls him Dr. John Dee, confirming he is Monty and not the Shadow Man, something I completely overlooked in part 1. As a part of this vast field of study, John Dee possessed what was reported to have been the largest library in England. Indeed, his library as a place of vast knowledge outside the university system became one of the most well-known locations of learning in Europe at the time. Unfortunately for Dee, after returning home to England after his time with Kelly in Europe, he found his house, and more importantly, his library totally vandalized, with his collection of knowledge lost. The parallels between this library and the KRONORIUM are notable, with the KRONORIUM almost serving as a second coming of this long since destroyed library, not just assembling all knowledge across space, but across time. Back to Revelations, in yet another intel within the map, this time a wisp, Monty tells us something that many players simply choose to ignore due to it being inconvenient and not fitting with our established timeline. He says that everything in the universe was normal, time was linear, until the first instance of teleportation by Group 935. We know, in fact, that this was Ultimus Richthofen, teleporting a walnut a few feet. At the time, Dr. Ludwig Maxis mocked Richthofen, making out that this discovery was insignificant. He couldn't have been more wrong.
These nuts. Got him!
Monty gives us a statement that almost serves as an alternative to the "in the beginning" entry in the timeline. The official version in the KRONORIUM reads, "In the beginning there was only the Ether and the Keepers. Among them were two beings who would later be known by many names. One would be known as Dr. Monty, the other as the Shadow Man." However, Monty's version is slightly different.
In the beginning, and believe me, there was a beginning, everything was in its proper place. Time was linear, just as it should be. But a little thing called element 115 changed all that. Especially when, what was it again? Oh, yes, when group 935 came along. Once they started messing around with it, they buggered everything up. 115 shouldn't even exist in your dimension. But nonetheless, here we are. Bloody teleporters.
Monty himself tells us that the beginning is not some grand event at the dawn of time, as the timeline puts it, but is essentially the moment Richthofen teleported the walnut at Der Ries. Before then, time was linear. The consequences of this were felt likely not only by John Dee in 1592, but all the way across time. Indeed, Monty credits this event with being the thing that broke time and the universe, fracturing it itself. In a later Revelations wisp, he says,
"The minute you people teleported for the first time, you changed the rules. How am I supposed to keep track if you keep moving the pieces? Even when you were just a little problem brewing in the far corner of existence, I tried to throw you a bone or two. I told you this, didn't I? The magic box of weapons, the little clues here and there. I always tried to give you a little help, without drawing too much attention to myself. The thing is, though, I can't just magic things out of thin air. I have to manipulate things that already exist in your reality.
like the perk drinks. They were something originally cooked up by Group 935. I just used them for my own ends. I honestly don't even know how they work. I swear. As for the songs, don't get me started.
This confirms the idea. The first teleportation is the true origin of everything. In addition to this, in Black Ops 4, they introduced the idea that the elemental shard's creation in binding the 4 souls of Ultimus to the crystal forever binds them to the ether itself. This is very much the same idea, being placed explicitly into the story. The Richthofen's original World War II experiments are far more important than any cosmic battle like the Great War. The way Monty presents himself, even the way he speaks, is quintessentially British. He crafts a world that looks like pristine, beautiful, pre-industrial England. The world John Dee himself knew. It's commonly known that the Revelations house area is meant to be Sheffield, and is even labelled as such in the files of the game, and back in the day I even visited Sheffield itself to explore a house that looks eerily similar to Monty's house, as if this is the inspiration for it. And it was even being sold by a Blundell estate agent, which I think is just a mere coincidence. That is just crazy though. Unfortunately for this theory, there is no direct link that I can find between Dee and Sheffield. However, the house looking the way it does is a clear sign that it is pre-industrial, as Sheffield became one of the world's most industrial cities during the Industrial Revolution, a far cry from what we see in the map. This was the height of English intellectualism, where figures like Dee would romanticize these gorgeous landscapes. Figures like Newton, who was contemporary to John Dee, was also mentioned mysteriously in Black Ops 3 with no reasoning. Now, with the John Dee connection, Newton's inclusion makes sense. He was involved in Elizabeth's court, as was Dee, and as a scientist, may well have been indoctrinated into the esoteric brotherhood of Dee Resurrectionists. Monty practiced alchemy himself, which are the perks and gobblegums in his factory, which just so happens to be in Der Riese, the very place of all of the teleportation that caused him to become Monty to begin with. Another interesting tidbit, Monty has a radio discussing how he spells rumour.
I know the Shadow Man's probably talking to you. Don't trust him. He's evil. I wouldn't piss on him if he was on fire. I bet he's saying all sorts of terrible things, spreading all kinds of rumors about me. By the way, I spell rumors with a U, after the O before the R. That's a nice little Easter egg. In fact, it's everything.
Why is this relevant? Spelling rumours with a U instead of without means that you spell it with the British English spelling, how I would spell it. Often in videos I spell it the American way because that's the majority of my audience, but regardless. This is interesting for our discussion because to spell something using British English habits would mean that Dr. Monty must have learned British English when he initially learns of the language and not simply be some all-knowing god figure from the beginning of his life. Rather, this lines up much more with the theory of him being John Dee before ascending to the mantle of Dr. Monty, leader of the Keepers, above creation, protector of the universe. It's crazy because we were all just so confused with Monty's line here because we clearly knew he was British by hearing his accent, so why would he need to point out it's an Easter egg directly to us? So much of Monty's dialogue has always felt really jarring, as if Blundell or whoever was writing them was trying to sneak in certain references intentionally. To me, this sounds like a direct call to action that this is about the impossible Easter egg when Blundell knew how much people were talking about it, and this was the final map of the game, a nice little bow. And John Dee's most famous portrait, I believe, is the inspiration for Monty's red scarf. This wouldn't even be the first time that John Dee was fictionalized into someone else's stories due to his obsession with the occult. A large inspiration for TREYARCH'S work on Black Ops 3 Zombies is H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft drew inspiration from Dee's mystical reputation. In Lovecraft's mythos, Dee is imagined as a translator of the Necronomicon, which is also a likely inspiration for the KRONORIUM and potentially even the Tome of Rituals in the Dark Ether narrative. And we will return to this later. writer. A further additional aside here is the origins of his name, Monty. Where does it come from? John Dee was notorious for using homophones, words that sound like other words in his encryption. For example, in one encryption, he uses the letters "fort" within the word "fourth" to actually mean 40, aka the number 40. Equally, he often used the letter L to actually mean EL, a biblical name for God. Monty and John Dee sound syntactically similar, so this may actually be the origin, a similar sounding codename. For John Dee and Monty sound phonetically very similar. Dr. Monty, aka Dr. John Dee. Dee has been swapped with T in his name, which is interesting when his use of triple T's or triple taus, as discussed in the last video, which is a symbol of 3 T's stacked vertically, are often encrypted in his ciphers, often at a cipher's base with a hidden 4th T, the quaternary, to validate it. Monty could refer to Monas Hieroglyphica, which is a complex emblem constructed from various astrological symbols, with elements of Latin wordplay, capitalization, spacing, and diacritics rendering its interpretation challenging. The symbol is intended to embody a profound concept, representing the unity of all creation influenced by celestial forces. Dee believed that this symbol contained the essence of alchemical transformation and spiritual evolution, and by mediating upon it, he aimed to access hidden knowledge transcending linguistic barriers. Emerging astrology, alchemy, mysticism, and metaphysics, the hieroglyphic monad serves as a visual manifestation of Dee's interconnected worldview. Does that not sound like Agatha, the physical manifestation of the ether, that binds celestial forces and their protectors, the Keepers, together? Even the glyph seems to resemble the Keeper's summoning staff. Tenuous? Maybe. But what I have to say next may convince you. Some of you may be thinking at this point that all of these connections are a bit sporadic. There's no connective tissue. The connection to the Tempest is pretty explicit, sure, but where's the glue that holds it all together? Well, during the research for this video, I found one more thing about John Dee that I think truly cements everything. If we search for John Dee's coat of arms, granted to him by the crown, what do we find? A golden lion on a red field. Yes, this can finally explain why the Gobblegum machine has a lion with red eyes atop it, a mystery that has long since puzzled us fans. And John Dee's Dee Resurrectionist could be a nod to Dee's Resurrectionist, as in his last name, even though it's spelled with just one E, aka D-E. Another little pun that could essentially boil down to Monty's Resurrectionist, aka Monty's Undead. John Dee grew up by Mortlake, London, which I think puts an entirely new perspective on this other funky wisp from Revelations.
Honestly, if you could see just what was going on outside your realm of perception, it would blow your minds. That's the main reason I kept it back. If I were to give you an analogy, I'd describe it like this. When a duck swims on the water, you only see it glide, apparently effortlessly across the lake. But underneath, as in beneath the surface, it's a whole different story. Its legs are moving like he's pedaling a fucking bicycle up a mountain. Well, that's me right now. I am that duck!
He specifically mentions a lake in it. I think this was another little push in the right direction. I believe that thanks to the hard drive leak, we have bypassed what was supposed to be a cipher solve to find out the biggest mystery of the zombie storyline. Jason Blundell said that once we start solving the hard revelation ciphers, things will start to appear in-game.
I'm thinking that people might not get a single one in DLC 4.
Not get a single cipher.
It's possible.
You're gonna make it that hard.
I think there's people out there who there's such passion in the community. I don't watch it close enough, but I am sure there are people who are still working on some of those ciphers.
Oh, of course there is, yeah.
And I love that, because there's other things that will appear.
That's because I think some of them will point in the direction of Monty being John Dee, as well as I believe the Der Eisendrache D-Book cipher or ciphers would have nudged us in the same direction, and we would have retroactively discovered all of the other clues in the game towards Monty being John Dee that I have been showing in this video upon their decryption had this not given us a head start. In fact, even in the very safe that's containing the De-Resurrectionist book, there is another book, Griffin Mond Basis, which is simply German for moon base. On the surface, this would just be referencing 935's base. However, now knowing what Dee specializes in, hiding words in plain English, and knowing of Monas Hieroglyphica, this could very well be a sign of Mon Dee, aka John Dee, aka Monty. It would be a reach on its own, but when combined with everything else in this video, it becomes paramount. With this Man of Shadows, who you go on to meet in Shadows of Evil, not being John Dee, and instead being an evil envoy of the Apothicons, who was he then? If Monty really is John Dee, and he was once human but calls the Shadow Man his friend, surely he was too. In part 1, I threw out some vague guesses. Perhaps he knew him. Perhaps on his ascension, John Dee split into two, like Monty's dialogue has implied.
Something else I should probably clarify. This is it. The ether. The infinite. Otherwise known as Agartha. Or is it Agartha? Well, whatever way you slice it or spell it, it's the reality beyond. Beyond the world you know. Beyond your perception. Just so we're clear, I'm absolutely not talking about death. That's a whole other can of worms. Speaking of which, you know how people say when you cut a worm in half, both parts keep on living? Well, they do. Kind of, for a bit. But then one of them dies, not sure if it's the arse or the head. Well, that's the problem with worms. They're a bit short on distinguishing features. What was the point I was making?
However, upon our research, I think we've identified who the Shadow Man might just be. Edward Kelly. Edward Kelly was an English alchemist, occultist, and self-proclaimed medium, best known for his close association with the renowned mathematician, astrologer, and scholar, yes, you've guessed that right, John Dee. Their friendship, which began in 1582, was rooted in a shared fascination with the supernatural and alchemy. Kelly approached Dee, claiming he could communicate with angels through a crystal ball, acting as a scryer, an older term for a seer who interprets visions. Dee, eager to unlock divine secrets, saw Kelly as a key to his esoteric pursuits. Together, they conducted numerous seances, during which Kelly supposedly channeled angelic messages into a mysterious language later called Enochian. These sessions fueled Dee's ambitions to decipher cosmic truths, and the duo became inseparable, even traveling across Europe to seek patronage for their work. Their relationship, however, was complex and strained by Kelly's erratic behavior and questionable motives. Some historians suggest Kelly may have manipulated Dee for personal gain, exploiting Dee's trust and intellectual prestige. Despite tensions, their collaboration produced significant occult works, including diaries of their angelic conversations. They would use a crystal ball and conduct seances with beings they referred to as angels, likely the early keeper species still experiencing their culture split over usage of the dark ether, and a key part in inspiring the different outlooks on the ether that these men would end up having. This crystal ball connecting with the ether also seems to mirror Monty's later usage of the snow globe, and the way it seems to have power over Agartha and the ether itself, most famously seen with Samantha in the Zombies Chronicles Remember Forever music video. And is especially interesting considering that Janus Richthofen still possesses this globe. Kelly's life took a dramatic turn after he and Dee parted ways in 1589. Kelly gained favour with Emperor Rudolf II in Prague, who was obsessed with alchemy and hoped Kelly could turn these metals into gold. Appointed as an alchemist in Rudolf's court, Kelly enjoyed his wealth and status briefly, but his inability to deliver on grand promises led to suspicion. In the early 1590s, he was arrested on charges of fraud or possibly treason, imprisoned in Austria. His captivity ended in 1597 under murky circumstances. The official account states he died attempting to escape, injuring himself after falling from a window or makeshift rope. However, rumours persist, supported by some contemporary reports, that Kelly poisoned himself, a theory that aligns with his flair for the dramatic but lacks definitive evidence. And what gives further evidence for this is that the Shadow Man lures the Morgue City residents by poisoning them in the very same way, marking them as cursed, tying them to his realm. With Edward Kelly, there's a quite obvious connection right off the rip. His name, Edward. If Edward Kelly is the Shadow Man, this already explains why he took such a liking to Edward Richthofen. They shared the same first name.
You do know that Richthofen is a friend of mine. I say friend, but really he's so much more than that. At one point, I almost considered him my apprentice. I mean, he did stab my reporter friend and steal the summoning key. But at one point he did everything I told him to. I keep hoping he'll remember the promise he made to me so long ago.
To take this one step further, Edward and John Dee were both fond of gematria. Gematria is a traditional Jewish numerology system that aligns numerical values to letters of the Hebrew alphabet, e.g. Aleph equals 1, Bet equals 2. By calculating the sum of a word's letters, practitioners identify symbolic meanings or connections between words sharing the same value, often to explore deeper spiritual or mystical insights. And what two words are the same in gematria, suggesting this spiritual and mystical connection? Shadow Man in simple gematria equals 98. Richthofen in simple gematria equals 98. But how exactly would Kelly have become the Shadow Man? Depending on what reports of his death are true, we may have already been handed the key. We know that for Kelly to have become the Shadow Man, he must have been tempted by the Apothicans and somehow chose. And then there's that mysterious language that Kelly would supposedly channel and transcribe from the angels he spoke to, called Enochian. Once you view the Enochian alphabet, this connection becomes clear, as you can see from the symbols on screen. This text is eerily reminiscent of the Apothicon language, and it's likely that in the zombie storyline, Enochian is actually simply Edward Kelly's interpretation of the Apothicon language after somehow communicating with these entities. We have seen before that with people like the Warden of Alcatraz's conversations with the Shadow Man, or the schizophrenic voices inside the head of Ultimus Richthofen, or the entity communicating to Ava, that creatures inside the Dark Ether can reach out and communicate with certain chosen people. Additionally, during their partnership, Kelly, along with Dee, constructed what Dee referred to as the Seal of God, a ritual seal that was instrumental in their communications with the angels. This seal not only looks remarkably similar to what we see all over Shadows of Evil and in the secret ritual chamber possessed by the Warden of Alcatraz, but is equally identical in purpose, being required in order to communicate with entities beyond the veil of our realm. Not only do the Shadows of Evil ritual symbols resemble it, but the Pack-a-Punch does too. The literal stone seal of God. In Glitching Queen's video, she has inside knowledge and says that she knows that these symbols were in fact based on John Dee and Kelly's work.
There's rumors that the ritual circles on Shadows of Evil are related to the KN-44 blueprint Easter egg in some way. I personally know that the ritual circles on Shadows of Evil are based on John Dee's summoning circles from way back when. He would use them to summon angels and demons. This guy was wild, but he was also incredibly intelligent. He spoke like a ton of languages. He was an alchemist. He was a philosopher. He worked with Queen Elizabeth. Like, this guy was the guy to know. He was amazing. He would do occult rituals with the symbol on the left. He called it the seal of God, and he said he could talk to angels and demons through it. And the angels actually told him about a language that they spoke called Enochian. Treyarch took that idea and made the ritual circles, and instead of using Enochian, they replaced it with Apothecon.
If we take a look back at the De-Resurrectionist emblem, yes, that is right. The exact same star symbols can be seen here. This is the through line showing us that it's all connected. What's crazier is that Kelly's magical golden disc seems to resemble the front of the MPD and the Sophia robot, which would inspire the Forsaken's containment chamber / SAM AI and the Project Janus logo in the Dark Ether timeline too. And finally, there's the elephant in the room, the subject of Edward Kelly's death. If these reports that he actually poisoned himself and caused his own death intentionally were true, then this would perfectly line up with the only other way we've ever seen a human in our world move to the Dark Ether and gain power from the Apothecons.
The time has come. The sponge is wet on my crown. The cap screws tightened. The switch in my hand. Oh, I'm going to burn. Oh, the fools. They want justice for the toll I've extracted from this forsaken island.
Sir, there's some men from the Bureau here. I stalled them as long as I could, but they're on their way to your office now. What do you want me to tell them?
Justice? Ah, there is no such thing. There's only the will of the Dark One.
Okay. I'll just tell them you're not feeling so well then, yeah?
Do as you wish. Run, hide, beg for absolution, and perhaps he will be merciful, as he has been with me.
Shh. Do not weep, my dear Warden.
My lord, you're here.
Of course. More or less. The threshold awaits, my friend.
Yes. Yes, the threshold. One last flash of light, and the sun shall vanish into the sea.
And the darkness?
The darkness shall spread. Through every fiber of creation it shall spread.
Listen, I told you, he ain't here. He went to see some special doc on the mainland. You guys are wasting your time.
I shall be its instrument.
Oh, come on, guys, cut me a break.
I shall bleed the chosen few.
Better hurry.
The gateway will open, and paradise will fall. Ah!
Yeah. See there? What I tell you, nobody's home. Nothing here.
This potential for a self-inflicted death inside a ritual allowing someone to go to the Dark Ether and gain supernatural powers from the Apothecons would make perfect sense for a dark mystic like Edward Kelly. And his desperation in this time of need makes him the perfect target to approach for a deal with the devil, so to speak. A tradition that, if he was to become the Shadow Man, he would continue to perpetuate with many other worlds, tricking them into believing he is Satan himself. The Warden had to die by electric chair, the same as the inmates, as he had to bond with them in the very same way. This lines up with the fact that in order to be purged, you have to die in the same way, as the Shadow Man did with poison. This aligns exactly with what Monty tells us about the Shadow Man, an idea that always seems somewhat at odds with how the origins of the Shadow Man were described in the official timeline, which states the Dark Ether. Some keepers begin to experiment with the Dark Ether, which corrupts and erodes their souls. Among them is the Shadow Man. However, Monty's recount of this sounds different and has an extra stage.
Now here's the thing. I knew a bloke, and I'm talking way back. He was the sweetest, most charming individual you could ever wish to meet. He was funny too. We used to have such a good old laugh together. Honestly, my sides hurt thinking about it. He was my friend. He was my best friend. And then the Apothicons got hold of him. Since then, he's pretty much acted as their agent, zipping around the galaxy. Wait, I keep changing it, don't I? Which do you prefer? Universe, multiverse, omni-fucking-verse? Oh, it doesn't really fucking matter, does it? Yeah, let's get on with it. Short version is, he's no longer sweet, charming, or funny. He's what brought them here, when he escaped the key.
Monty says that the Apothicons, already existing, convinced the Shadow Man to join them, whereas the official timeline acts as if he was there from the beginning. They got a hold of him. Monty's first-hand account of knowing him prior and willingness to sacrifice the multiverse if it meant rescuing his friend surely suggests the timeline entry is the correct one here, though. But wait. Monty and the Shadow Man were friends before each being chosen by their irrespective factions. If Monty was a keeper when friends with the Shadow Man, was the Shadow Man also a keeper, or was he human or otherwise first when they were friends, before being recruited as the Apothicons' agent? A Grodkrovi cipher states, in the beginning there was only the keepers. But then corruption of the Dark Ether leached its way into the realm and twisted the minds of some of the keepers. These keepers turned to shadows of their former selves and eventually became the Apothicons. Yet another Grodkrovi cipher states, KRONORIUM excerpt 34956-1223, the summoning key is one of the oldest artifacts in all creation. It was used by the first one to mix all the dimensions with life, giving each one its unique balance. So was the first one the original keeper? This is the only ever mention in canon about the first one. It's never explicitly stated or confirmed who they are. It's not even mentioned in the official timeline, or what they become or where they go. But considering the KRONORIUM states, in the beginning there was only the Ether and the Keepers, one as Monty, the other as the Shadow Man. This would suggest that the first one was a Keeper, and Monty and the Shadow Man were too. But the problem is, the Keepers are the creators of the KRONORIUM, and so, much like a government writing their own books, it would be propagandized in their favor, especially when they view themselves as the universe's protectors. They would want a story that would make them sound like its inherent guardian in their DNA, the reason for existence to begin with. This is impossible because they cannot have always been keepers from the very beginning, thanks to this revelation's wisp.
The Keepers, an ancient order who'd been granted the wisdom to see beyond the limitations of their own realm. Even while the rest of mankind scrabbled around in the dirt, drinking their own piss, the Keepers took the mantle of benevolent watchers. Like the seers and sages of the old world, they could foresee how the actions of the Apothicons would lead to the destruction of life itself. The Keepers have always been here, much like your good selves. They too were scattered and fragmented across the multiverse. They may have acted erratically, but know this. Their actions were only ever concerned with the preservation of life itself. Remember what I said before about energy.
In this wisp, Monty states that the Keepers took the mantle as benevolent watchers. This would suggest that they were not always keepers, but at some point chose to take on the mantle as keepers of the universe, which would suggest the KRONORIUM is wrong, or at least just simplifying down how things played out. In the beginning, there were not only the keepers, but there was potentially a first race spawned by the first one that would go on to see themselves as the keepers. This passage also does suggest suggest that the Keepers predated time and humanity, and they have always been there. And once humanity sprung about in their universes, thanks to the first one using the summoning key, giving the dimensions a unique mix of life, they oversaw us and other species with their expansive knowledge of all of time at once too. This all lines up perfectly with the theory of this video, that the Keepers were around before Monty, and he was one of those humans scrabbling around in the dirt before his ascension to the Keepers Legion, especially with the phrase like the seers and sages of the old world. Seers and sages are people endowed with profound moral and spiritual insight or knowledge, a wise person or sage who possesses intuitive powers, much like John Dee and Edward Kelly. In the real world, the Old World is a term for Afro-Eurasia coined by Europeans after 1493, when they became aware of its existence of the Americas. Or it's often an adjective belonging to or associated with former times, especially when considered quaint and attractive, such as medieval towns which still retain Old World charm. However, what if in the zombie storyline it can be taken more literally?
Our ways are of the old world. We will not be forgotten.
But the old world, as in the original timeline, the first cycle, the original universe when time was linear, when John Dee and Edward Kelly may have been human, before the fracturing of their universe. After all, ancient Dark Ether gods are often referred to as Old Ones, including some apothegons, which is a nice little tie with Old World. Remember, Monty largely serves as the narrator for the story, a powerful god to tell us things as they supposedly are. His very insertion in the story was a way for Treyarch to make sense of all of the prior canon. But is he to be believed? Ever since his introduction to the forefront of the story in Gorod Krovi, suddenly it seems like he was responsible for everything that shapes the narrative. The perks, war weapons, songs.
Don't get me started.
It seems very odd and jarring that a character we don't hear of once for 3 whole games is suddenly everything. But both Monty and the Shadow Man claim each other are liars.
You do realize that he's manipulated you? That's what he does. Dr. Monty is just one of the many names he's been known by. The Great Dragon, the Beast. Is this ringing any bells? Beelzebub? Lucifer? Satan? The devil?
We cannot trust their origin stories directly from them, especially when they often talk in cryptic tongues. It's also interesting to remember, as we mentioned earlier, H.P. Lovecraft wrote that John Dee translated the Necronomicon, the likely heavy piece of inspiration for the KRONORIUM / the timeline. And this, combined with the fact that the KRONORIUM is actually written in Apothecon and not Keeper, may imply that the book was originally translated by John Dee too, allowing him to essentially change any timeline entries without telling us. So, with all of this information about both of these men now under our belt, I believe we can begin to reassess the origins of the Ether story and its cycle, and the basis for how it all really began, as teased in the intro to this video. In the beginning, there was the first one. With their power, they created the summoning key, and the Keepers born in their image. The Keepers were higher dimensional beings, and the first one created Agartha, a dimension where the Ether, their higher plane, was made physical so they could manifest themselves, ascending above creation and reality, before then creating many universes and filling them with life. Eventually, the first one would disappear for unknown reasons, leaving only the Keepers to watch over their creation from above. But some Keepers would go on to discover the Dark Ether, a twisted version of the Ether, capable of great power, but also corrupting those who came into contact with it. Because of this discovery, Keeper society would split. Those who saw fit to use this dark energy for experimentation and power, and those who wished to lock it away and keep its corruption separate from the reality the first one had created. This split fractured their society. The Keepers using the Dark Ether were banished into it, trapped inside, corrupting and becoming the apothecans over eons. The rest were fractured across the multiverse, without purpose, leaving the apothecans to begin their schemes and experiments with the dark ether. Much later in time, during human history, born in 1527, Dee had established himself as one of Elizabethan England's most learned figures, a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. By late 1570s, he was in his early 50s, living at his family home in Mortlake, a modest but book-filled estate west of London. His library, one of the largest in England, boasted over 3,000 volumes, reflecting his voracious appetite for knowledge across science and the occult. Dee's life was a mix of prestige and frustration. He had enjoyed royal patronage, casting horoscopes for Elizabeth's coronation in 1558, and advising on navigation for England's burgeoning maritime expansion. Yet, his interests were drifting beyond the practical. Dee was increasingly consumed by a desire to commune directly with the divine, believing that angels held the key to universal truths. He dabbled in scrying, using reflective surfaces like mirrors or crystal balls to see visions, but lacked the natural talent or patience for it. His experiments yielded little, leaving him restless. Financially, Dee was strained. Supporting a growing family, he married his third wife, Jane Fromond, in 1578 and had young children, and maintaining his library stretched his resources thin. He petitioned the crown for more support, but rewards were inconsistent. Socially, he faced skepticism. His blend of science and mysticism earned him both admiration and suspicion, with whispers of sorcery dogging his reputation. By 1581, Dee's diaries reveal a man doubling down on his spiritual quest. He began recording strange events, mysterious knocks at his home, dreams of celestial beings, interpreting them as signs he was close to a breakthrough. He prayed fervently for divine guidance, acquiring a polished obsidian mirror, later dubbed a spirit mirror, to aid his scrying attempts. Yet, without a skilled intermediary, his efforts faltered. In 1582, Dee met Edward Kelly, very much a kindred spirit in all things mystical, though with a somewhat suspicious past as a forger. Together, they began what became the most notorious part of their respective careers, their alleged summoning of angels. During these rituals, using a star-shaped seal, the pair would summon these entities, likely the apothecans, and commune with them, with Dee and Kelly even reported to have received a new mystical language from them, the so-called Enochian alphabet, which in all actuality was the Proto-Keeper language, basically the apothecan language, but before it became known as such. Considering the KRONORIUM is written in apothecan and not Keeper, this heavily implies that this language existed first, and over time the Keeper's language evolved, whereas the apothecans, due to their corruption, remained stuck in the past. Eventually, the two fell out over favour in Elizabeth's court and fled to continental Europe to continue their experiments in peace. Within 5 years, however, Dee decided to return to England, with Kelly staying behind in Europe in service to the European monarchs. It's also possible the angels they summoned could have been both apothecans and keepers, with either side trying to tempt them, or each person. In the dank cell of Kazivoklat Castle, just outside of Prague, in late 1597, Edward Kelly sat in chains, his spirit eroded by captivity. The alchemist's downfall had been stark, his boast of gold for Emperor Rudolph II proven empty, his body broken from a failed escape that left him barely alive. As the torchlight cast long, mocking shadows, Kelly chanted, pleaded with a desperately carved icon, the seal of God once devised by his old friend, his friend who had abandoned him. Anger gave way to despair, then hopelessness, then silence, then the voices, not of this world, whispered in his mind, familiar from his scrying days, though now tingled with menace. Kelly's head tilted. Listening, he'd once again called them angels, but these were the apothecans, ancient entities from the dark ether. Years before, they'd guided him through the crystal ball, masquerading as divine beings. Now, in his hour of need, they returned, their presence unseen but undeniable. Their words words pressed into his thoughts, offering escape and unimaginable power. They tempted him with a new role as their leader, the Shadow Man, a master in their dark realm, if he'd surrender his soul to their service. The price was his life, taken by his own hand. Kelly's mind reeled. The voices conjured visions of a world where he ruled through shadow, no longer a scorned fraud, but a figure of dread. His trembling fingers found a vial of poison, perhaps arsenic, a secret from his alchemical past. The unseen entities intensified their call, pushing him towards the act. With a last, defiant look at the world that had cast him aside, Kelly drank the poison. Its fire scorched his throat, and as his senses dimmed, the voices swelled, enveloping him. To the guards who found this lifeless form, it was a suicide. But in the dark ether, Kelly descended, plunging into the dark depths of reality, reborn as the Shadow Man, his soul forever bound to the apothecans, his legacy twisted into a dark myth lying below creation. It's also possible the angels John Dee and Kelly conjured with before were in fact keepers before some split into the apothecans, and some of them remembered Kelly and came for him, but didn't see Monty as manipulatable. At the end of the day, all of the apothecans were once keepers, and they began experimenting with the dark ether. However, they didn't become the faction of apothecans immediately. It took some time for them to further and further corrupt. Potentially it was only keepers contacting John Dee and Edward Kelly, but it was these corrupted keepers, not apothecans yet, that would go on to choose Edward Kelly, and only after recruiting him do they fragment. A great war then ensues between the keepers and the apothecans, with Monty and the Shadow Man now joining them. The apothecans lose and are cast down below creation. Meanwhile, John Dee continued on with his old life, racked with guilt over feeling responsible for his friend's death and leaving him behind in Austria. Queen Elizabeth installed John Dee as the warden of Christ College, Manchester. This coincides with the document I shared earlier. This means it was here where Dee performed his first experiments that would lead to the involvement in the ether storyline, detecting the ripples cast through time and space by the first initial teleportation test at Der Riese. By 1600, the extreme energy given off by the destruction of the Earth during Richthofen's grand scheme reached Dee, and accidentally caused the reanimation of a corpse in his laboratory. Horrified, yet intrigued, he sought royal assent from Queen Elizabeth I to establish the esoteric Brotherhood of De-Resurrectionists, with the sole purpose of studying the ether and protecting the world from whatever threats may come of it. Finally, in the winter of 1608, John Dee, now firmly at the helm of his Brotherhood, undertook his most intensive experiments so far. This just so happens to align with the first London Frost Festival, wherein, during the intense winter of 1608 to 1608, the Thames froze over completely. These experiments seem to have made John Dee, 81 at the time, immortal and incredibly powerful, and it's possible that the Frost Festival was a side effect of this, possibly a similar effect to the snow we see in the Giants intro cutscene, caused by time stopping, the fracturing of the universe, which is made up of ice, the world ice theory. Once he ascended, John Dee began to take stock of the status of the world from his higher level of existence, whilst the humans believed he simply died. At this time, a zombie outbreak may have ensued. Potentially 115 was even deposited here, further tying into the freezing river. And why under Eisendrach there are newspaper reports of a zombie outbreak during a festival. Meanwhile, John Dee came into contact with other higher dimensional beings, but not the corrupted ones his old friend had come into contact with. Rather, he came into contact with the remnants of the Keepers, working together to learn to communicate with them. He helped them develop a language they could all speak together. This language was based on numerology, as Dee was a mathematician, perhaps through a misunderstanding when initially teaching them language, or perhaps to complete his rebirth into a new being. John Dee took on a new title, Doctor Monty, self-inserting the name as Doctor, one he was never officially able to be granted, but one he wished he held, potentially a nod to Doctor Who as well, with the circular symbols language we see in the Crazy Place pillars or the MPD, in the tomb and elsewhere, very much resembling the Time Lord's language. Together, John Dee helped them reform their separated society and taught them the ways of his Brotherhood of De-Resurrectionists, protecting the worlds from the dangers of the ether and what it could do. They help him ascend to Agartha, essentially a heaven-like realm, and teach him of the dark ether and the apothegms. But this is not death, for that is a whole lot more complicated. He learns that while he had thought his friend dead, he had been wrong. His old friend, Edward Kelly, now known as the Shadow Man, although he took on many names throughout history, had begun to work hand in hand with the apothegms after descending into the dark ether, when he supposedly died. The Shadow Man had become an envoy of the apothegms, helping them invade and devour universes across the multiverse. Dr. Monty's goal was now twofold: prevent the destruction of the multiverse at the hands of the apothegms, but also, and perhaps more important to him, right the greatest wrong of his life, solve his one regret, and save his old friend, the Shadow Man. This meant that the destruction of the apothegms outright was impossible, as it would mean losing his friend. However, as powerful as Monty had become, he could not simply snap his fingers and change his old friend as he could most facets of reality. Everyone still retained free will. And this is also because Edward's rebirth into the Shadow Man involved the one thing that Dr. Monty had no power over. The one thing in this world he had never experienced, and would never until the world itself was coming to an end: death. This puts a whole new meaning on this quote that I had already played for you nearer to the beginning of this video.
I'm absolutely not talking about death. That's a whole other can of worms. You know how people say when you cut a worm in half, both parts keep on living, but then one of them dies?
Monty contextualized himself and the Shadow Man's relationship as like worms. When cut in half, one dies, the other lives. But which one is it? Well, with this knowledge, it would imply that John Dee rose and ascended to Dr. Monty, but never died, whereas Edward Kelly died and fell below creation into the dark ether, with Agartha essentially being like heaven, the dark ether essentially being like hell. One was gifted immortal life, the other had to shed blood, the opposite of life. Monty never died, and that is why he says, I am not talking about death here, because Agartha, the ether, is not death. However, some who die do end up in the dark ether. However, with things as they are, the multiverse was quickly spiraling towards the end of everything. While Monty and the Keepers did their best to protect and preserve reality, the apothegms would still slowly consume worlds one by one. With no other option, Monty, not willing to lose the world or give up on his friend, chose the third option. He trapped reality within a cycle, creating a point where time both ended and began, restarting creation time and time again, with Revelations, which has so many biblical parallels, and considering he was a devout Christian, albeit adjacent to it in many regards, it explains that. But at the same time, he doomed all living beings in reality to potentially infinite cyclical suffering, and continue to break reality more and more each time. Monty hoped to eventually stall long enough to find a way to save his old friend. To do so, he reached out to find the start of those ripples across time he'd felt all those years ago, and found Dr. Edward Richtofen performing teleporter experiments at Der Rees. He found that Richtofen had used the elemental shard on himself and 3 test subjects, permanently intertwining their souls with the ether. This meant that he could not wipe Richtofen from existence, and instead needed to make sure he could not harm reality further, but stayed protected, as his soul no longer existing would mean the ether too would cease to exist, the whole universe and Monty with it. Meanwhile, the Shadow Man too saw the importance of Richtofen, and sharing a first name with him took very special interest in Edward Richtofen. Once Edward had touched the MPD, a powerful creation of the apothegms from their initial experiments with the dark ether, the Shadow Man became able to speak to him directly, corrupting him, driving him insane, as he took him on as an apprentice. To prevent further destruction of reality, preserve his loop, and protect the essence of Richtofen and the others who were entwined with the ether, Monty created the plan for the House and the Great War, a place where the souls could survive the chaos during the reset of the cycle, and a way to put them at the beginning and end of time itself. This was far from a perfect solution. The apothegms had his friend in their clutches and were unlikely to let go anytime soon, and worse still, with every cycle, more teleportation occurred. More Element 115 found its way deeper and deeper into the multiverse, and time became more and more fractured. But if nothing else, Monty now had time time to perhaps devise a plan. The irony is, of course, this is the same logic held by Primus Richthofen in collecting the blood vials from Alcatraz. If he could just survive one more loop, if he could just put his death off for one more eternity, then perhaps he'd arrive at a solution. The sad truth is there was no solution here. It was a zero-sum game, and ultimately one that Monty never even intended to play. Perhaps this is why Monty continuously displays a hatred and distrust for Richthofen. He knows it was ultimately him to make the first mistake, the first teleportation that made everything else a certainty. And also, he probably hates himself too for perpetuating the cycle, and likens himself to that of Richthofen doing the same. Somewhere along the lines, Monty became corrupted by the Dark Ether too, whilst trying to save the Shadow Man. Or maybe the corruption wasn't from the Dark Ether directly, but it was merely the insanity that plagued his mind by endlessly perpetuating the cycle, because after all, repetition is the definition of insanity, and what more literal repetition than the very cycle of the universe that happened for millennia, and he was one of the most responsible for. He had to die, Richthofen had to die, they all had to die. It was always coming to what we saw on Tag der Toten. It just had to take one to realise it on Blood of the Dead. We hear Dr. Monty also read a section of the Divine Comedy.
Midway, this way of life we're bound upon, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, where the right road was wholly lost and gone. Me, how hard to speak of it. That rude and rough and stubborn forest. The mere breath of memory stirs the old fear in the blood. But when, at last, I stood beneath a steep hillside, which closed that valley's wandering maze, whose dread had pierced me to the heart-root deep, then I looked up and saw the morning rays mantle its shoulder from that planet bright, which guides men's feet aright on all their ways.
Well, John Dee would have been quite old, so not exactly midway through his life when he would become immortal, there's a bit of a deeper parallel to make here. At this point in Dante's Inferno, the section of the Divine Comedy this is from, Dante is in limbo. He is an endless forest, and the only way he ends up escaping limbo is by journeying into hell. This can perhaps be seen as John Dee / Monty using poetry to explain his situation to us. He is trapped in limbo, the cycle, stuck forever, but unable to move on because the only way forward for him is through hell, the dark ether / the breaking of the cycle and losing his friend. However, every time at the start of the cycle, he would look up and see the sun rise, see the lush trees, the wind breezing against his face, and he would have a glimmer of hope that this time it might be different. But as we know, it never was, and he never got to save his friend. But that ambition is what kept him going. When asked in Tag der Toten to explain Monty, the Shadow Man, the Apothecans, and so on to the rest of their compatriots, Nikolai gives an odd answer. He says they were legends contained within the KRONORIUM. After a probing remark by Richthofen, Nikolai very succinctly says that both Monty and the Shadow Man were more similar than anyone realised. Both were corrupted by the Dark Ether, the Shadow Man by his own ambition, and Monty by desperately trying to save his friend. Nikolai recognised the truth, that these two godlike entities were, in reality, victims to the actions of Primus and Ultimus, and vice versa, to be honest. Their corruption was not some sort of eternal cosmic evil, but one born of humanity. Perhaps we think that burning the house down and watching Monty writhe in pain and agony would be satisfying, but with all of this new information, Nikolai's perspective makes total sense. How could it be right to take revenge on someone who never even wanted to be in this situation in the first place? Although at the very same time you could argue, yes, they still all played a role in perpetuating the cycle, regardless of who tipped the first domino. In this ending, we hear from Nikolai that he says that it is the journey itself that he and his companions have been on that is the start of all of the madness, not the influence of Monty and the Shadow Man. And given all of this, I finally think I agree with him.
Our journey is the very reason this madness exists. We are the ones who fractured the universe. This is the truth the KRONORIUM showed me. The truth Richthofen could no longer face.
From as far back as World at War, we were challenged by Treyarch to distrust the narration of this story. Be it Richtofen's outright lies in his dialogue in Der Riese, Teddy is a liar, and the ciphers and radios in that map that suggest his true agenda, to the grand scheme in Black Ops 1, to Maxis' betrayal in Black Ops 2, to the Origins ending being a deliberate misdirect, making us think it may have all just been a children's game. We were all aware that this was Treyarch's speciality. And yet, when we reached Black Ops 3, when we were given a brand new figure guiding the story, we were totally accepting of him. We may have viewed Monty with some skepticism, but not once did anyone in the community truly try and piece together the reasoning this mysterious character was here. We just took him at face value. We were all fooled for so long. The truth is, Monty and the Shadow Man may have been human all along. The Keepers and the Apothecans were already warring before they joined them and aided them. They were chosen by each faction, and their duality was the duality of their friendship that spanned before their ascension and ascension. And think about it, has it never felt strange to you that Monty and the Shadow Man have human and Keeper/Apothecan forms? Yet, as far as we know, we've never seen another Apothecan or another Keeper have a human form as well. Why would they be the only ones to have this ability? Well, that could be because that was their original form. This changes our perspective on literally everything. This is how the story began, in the very first cycle, the very first world, the very first linear timeline, as Monty put it, until everything changed once time travel got involved. The video made by Glitching Queen on the potential lead for the impossible Easter egg undoubtedly served as the starting point for this video. The links to John Dee seemed incredibly interesting, and when I found that developer document on the hard drive, I became certain that the lead involving the Der Eisendrache books was legitimate. However, let's ask ourselves, what could the impossible Easter egg truly be? If that cipher is indeed the starting point, what is the ending truly? John Dee's ciphers, particularly the ones that may relate to the impossible Easter egg, were designed to conceal the identity of another friend of his, a man who many people believe to be the true William Shakespeare. To those in the field of English literature, this revelation, if proven, would obviously change everything, forcing us to re-examine the entire corpus of Shakespeare and come to brand new conclusions. I believe that Treyarch took the idea and ran with it for their impossible Easter egg, and that the information contained within would lead players down the path of exploration that ends at Doctor Monty and John Dee. Just as John Dee in our world hid a secret that would shake all of literature to its foundations, I believe Treyarch wished to do the same with Doctor Monty's identity, and create a secret that, if found, would change everything. The impossible Easter egg, in essence, is understanding the zombie storyline to the fullest extent. And if we take a look back at Jason's 8 years comment in the actual context of his statement, what does he say?
I'm going to put that away in a vault and talk to you again about it in 8 years' time.
Okay.
And what's inside the vault in Der Eisendrache in the teleporter room? Yes, that is right, the very John Dee book. The core book that is central to the rest scattered around the map. Blundell said that the impossible Easter egg was supposed to be scattered across different arenas.
And they'll be hidden in different arenas, and you won't get this one.
But we've only been thinking in 2D and 3D. Something simple like things we need to find on a map or maps or a texture file, but we need to think bigger across the entire game. As we know that the ether is 4-dimensional, incomprehensible to our minds, we need to think in 4D, like the KN44 hypercube. The offhand dialogue of O before the U, he's not a real doctor, to the scattered books into Eisendrache, to out-of-game leaks, to Blundell's hints and interviews, the puzzle pieces to the impossible Easter egg and Monty's true identity are literally scattered everywhere across arenas. Some almost seem coincidental, yet missing even just one of the vital pieces, and it's impossible. Like it was always intended to be. Like the ether, this transcends across dimensions and many forms of space in and outside of our community. It is not just one solve, it's an unraveling of information and clues. There won't be one day where we can say the impossible Easter egg is done with, because that's not the point. It's a ball of string that as you pull and pull and pull, it never ends. It is timeless. It is impossible because it cannot be be fully solved. Think about it. Blundell would not say an Easter egg is impossible, that we cannot get, if actually it's just very, very, very difficult. That's not the definition of impossible. A criticism that many have levied against Black Ops 3 over the years is that it's fundamentally devalued the role of what many viewed as the golden age of the zombie story. At least those who were there from the beginning, in its origins days. People feel in the alien stuff and the bigger picture of it all took away a lot of the mysteries, especially when the timeline was released. They felt, well, that's that. The theories are over. We've now gotten away from the clandestine experiments, secret plots, and unreliable narrators, with many people laying this criticism squarely at the feet of Jason Blundell and Craig Houston. Although I think that's changed a lot now because people are not gelling with the Dark Ether story, but this was a criticism I saw, especially during the Black Ops 4 days. Now I think people look fondly on that era, Mob of the Dead to Tag der Toten. In hindsight, and many always did, but there was definitely some that felt like it got away from the more rough edges of the origins of the Nazi zombies narrative. If this impossible Easter egg that these two friends were so proud of is truly what we have discussed here, then it would seem their last act, their final magic trick, years after the story was over, was to retroactively make the early storyline that many of us cherish the single most important period of time in the entire saga. What an Easter egg that would be. Now, with this new understanding of how the Ether story may have began, and who Dr. Monty and the Shadow Man really may have been, all of the Ether storyline is painted in an entirely new context. As big as all of this is, I think its greatest potential is where we still have left to go with it. We can now go back to the impossible Easter egg with new perspective, and feel much more confident in the John Dee cipher solution that Queen presented back in that old video. While I believe the core of the impossible Easter egg is solving the story of John Dee and Edward Kelly becoming Monty and the Shadow Man and seeing through the lies they tell us, I do believe there's real potential in this cipher method as hiding some sort of message or messages, considering John Dee ciphers can have multiple solutions, and what we've discussed in this video. And maybe Treyarch never expected us to put together the John Dee clues on our own because they definitely did not expect this hard drive leak. So I am wondering if potentially the solution to this cipher may be that key to lead us on the right track if this leak didn't occur. So maybe it won't actually tell us any new information, stuff that we haven't already sussed out. However, it would give us the in-game confirmation, something not through leaks. And I'm sure that even more Monty and the Shadow Man / the cycle related things in the storyline will be completely shifted by these revelations, pun intended, than what I've managed to find and mention in my research with the Codlore Facts team here. But with that being said, this is where we hand it off to you. We need your help to keep working at the possible ciphers and taking a second look at the Ether storyline with this context to find more hidden parts to these stories of Dee and Kelly. So research into these two real-life figures and try and find any parallels you can make towards the game or the canon. And definitely keep trying to crack at the John Dee cipher as well as any of the unsolved ciphers in Black Ops 3, especially on Revelations, because it really wouldn't surprise me, with that being the Shadow Man and Monty-centric map, that they may pertain to their origins and how it could relate to all of this. And be sure to check out Glitch and Queen's initial video on the cipher for more information on how to solve it. I'll leave a link to that in the description, as well as a link to Codlore Facts once again. And I'll also leave a link to part 1, of course, so definitely go ahead and check that out after you're done with this one. But with that being said, thank you for watching the video. This is one of my most exciting videos I've ever produced. I'm so proud of it, and I'm so looking forward to hopefully making a part 3. But I will only make that if there's actually new information that we discover. So let's get cracking. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.